You ever stop to think about how many choices you make every day? From the time that you woke up this morning to this moment right now, how many choices have you made? I'd guess probably dozens, if not maybe hundreds of choices you've probably made that have led you to this moment. You probably woke up this morning and you chose what time you were going to wake up. You chose whether or not you would eat breakfast. You chose what you would eat for breakfast. You chose whether or not you were going to brush your teeth before or after you took a shower. You chose whether or not you would take a shower. If you did take a shower, you probably chose whether or not you were going to use shampoo and or conditioner. When you got out of the shower, you chose how you were going to style your hair. Ladies, how you would do your makeup. You chose all kinds of things, like your outfit this morning, the shoes that you wore, the route that you took to get here, the parking spot that you parked in this morning. You chose whether or not you would pull your attendance peg when you got to the building this morning. You chose which seat you were going to sit in. You chose who you were going to talk to and what, in fact, you were going to say to those people. And you're choosing at this very moment to listen to me right now. You will choose how you interpret the things that I say, and you will choose how you apply the things that we say this morning. All the choices that we make in our life very frequently are minor choices. They're choices which really don't have a whole lot of impact, like choosing to turn on the microphone and make it a little bit louder. Can you hear me now? So we make choices every day. And a lot of the choices that we make are very minor, things we don't even think about, but a lot of the choices that we make are big choices, large, substantial choices, choices which take time, thought, and energy to make. We choose what neighborhood we're going to live in. We choose what house we're going to buy. We choose where we're going to go to school and where we're going to apply for a job. We choose who we're going to marry. We choose what kind of parents we're going to be. And ultimately, at the end of the day, we will choose whether or not we're going to be faithful to the Lord. And so whether we make small choices or large choices, we're always choosing. Always. And if there's one thing that I know about choice, is that we are always going to be held responsible for those choices. If you look in Ezekiel chapter 18, the book of Ezekiel is not a place that we go very frequently to talk about our responsibility or our living as a Christian today. But in Ezekiel chapter 18 and verse 19, we read, "Yet you say, why should the son bear the guilt of the father? Because the son has done what is lawful and right, and has kept his statutes and observed them, he shall surely live. The soul who sins shall die. The son shall not bear the guilt of the father, nor the father the guilt of the son. The righteousness of the righteous shall be upon himself, and the wickedness of the wicked shall be upon himself." When you make choices in your life, you're responsible for those choices. No one else is responsible for those choices except for you. And so when we understand that we are responsible for the things that we choose, when we are responsible and no one else can be responsible for the things that we choose, it's very clarifying for us, because we will all give account for the deeds that we've done in the body, whether they're good or whether they're bad. And so we're always choosing, and we're always responsible for what we choose to do. But there are times where we don't make choices, that we don't make choices about things in our life. Things happen to us that we don't choose, and we are in fact not to blame for, but still responsible for. The fact is, blame and responsibility are not the same thing. We get those things confused very often. We think oftentimes blame and responsibility are the same thing, but they're not. Yes, if I were to hit you with my car this morning, I would be both to blame and responsible legally for taking care of that. But if you were to wake up one morning and you were to find on your doorstep a newborn baby, you would not be to blame for that baby being there, but you would now be responsible for what you did with that baby. You would be responsible for the choices that you made regarding that baby. You could bring it in, You could leave it on the doorstep. You could raise the baby as your own. You could call the police. All the choices that you would make, you would be responsible for. But you would not be to blame for the situation you were in. We understand this. This happens to us as parents. As parents, I'm not to blame for the choices that Ashlyn makes. I'm not at fault for the choices that Ashlyn makes. However, I am still responsible for how I deal with Ashlyn. We have 6 wonderful elders here at this congregation, and they are not going to stand in judgment to blame for the choices that you and I make. They will not bear our sins on that last day, the guilt of our sins, but they are still responsible. As the song we sang before the lesson about Christ being a shepherd and leading us, that's their job. Their job as shepherds is to be responsible. So that when that one sheep goes astray and leaves the rest of the 99 behind, they go after that one sheep and bring that sheep back because they're responsible. They may not be to blame for their choices, for the choices of those members, but they are always responsible. So blame and responsibility are not the same thing. And I think this is important for us to understand because we go through things in our lives very often that are challenging. We go through things in our lives that are very difficult for us to deal with. And sometimes we feel like the problems that we are going through, the struggles, the pain, the trials that we are going through, which we have not chosen, but are still happening to us, are outside of our control. We no longer have control over our lives. We're at the mercy of someone else's choices. You see, when we make good choices, when choices come about that are positive, and we make those choices, sometimes we feel like, fighting and jockeying for position about who gets to take credit for those choices. When you find yourself in a situation at work where you've made some really positive choices, things go well, you might find yourself, trying to edge out your coworkers on who gets to take credit. But what happens when you don't make good choices? What happens when you make poor choices? We do something very natural, actually, and it's something that man has done since the very beginning of time. What we do is we blame others, don't we? Remember, as God told Adam and Eve not to eat of the fruit of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, and they did, and they realized they were naked, and they hid from God, and God comes to them, and he says, "Who told you you were naked?" And Adam looks to his wife, looks to God, and says, "The woman which you gave to me gave me that fruit, and I ate." In effect, what Adam was saying is, I'm not responsible. This woman made me do it. She's to blame. And oh, by the way, God, you're kind of to blame too, because you gave her to me. And the woman looks at the serpent and looks back to God and says, "The serpent deceived me, and I ate." And she didn't take responsibility. She made the choice, but she didn't take responsibility. And so we understand that it's very easy for us to blame others for what's going on. Whether we make choices or not, we are always choosing. Whether we are to blame for the situation, Adam may not have been to blame for being tempted to eat that by his wife, and Eve may not have been to blame for being tempted to eat that fruit by the serpent, but who was responsible for the consequences of that decision? They were. They were booted out of the garden. And so we need to understand that in our life, we're going to go through trials, whether things are happening to us or whether we are making choices, we are always responsible. We have members here who have gone through some great struggle and pain. Members here who have experienced things that I will never, hopefully, ever know. And I'm not in any way trying to minimize the pain that you are going through, the pain and the suffering and the struggle that you're going through. But what I am saying is that while you may not be to blame for those situations in your life, you are always responsible for how you handle those situations in your life. John Banks is not to blame for having cancer. John Banks did not choose to have cancer. But John Banks is still responsible for how he lives with cancer. Holly Wagner did not choose to have MS. Holly Wagner is not to blame for having MS. But Holly is still responsible for how she lives with that disease. If you've read through any of the biographies on the website, you may have come across Barbara Gatlin's biography. And in there, she talks about how people often ask her why she's so happy living with stage 4 cancer. And she talks about how the cancer really hasn't brought her that much pain, but it's been the chemotherapy and all the medications that have brought about all kinds of side effects that have been undesirable and very painful for her. But she says, I have a helper. And with God's help, I can make it through, and I can be a good example for others. That's the point. If you take nothing else away from this whole lesson today, understand this. And I use these 3 examples of members of our congregation because I believe in spite of great pain and struggle and difficulty, they don't blame their choices on others. They don't blame their attitude on anyone else. They take responsibility. And they live with the situations in their life in a way that shows great responsibility. And they're good examples for us. And we can look to them and we can see that when we go through similar things that we can also be strong and take courage. I don't know if you saw the movie Spider-Man. In the movie Spider-Man, Uncle Ben is about to die and he looks up at Peter Parker, who is Spider-Man, by the way. I didn't mean to ruin the surprise. He looks up at Peter Parker and he says, with great power comes great responsibility. I want to flip that today. And I want to say that with great responsibility comes great power. Because when you struggle with things, when you're going through difficult times in your life, you may feel very well like everything is out of control. But you always have a choice about how you're going to respond. And you will always be held accountable for that choice. So for the purposes of this morning's lesson, what I want to do is I want to look at some reasons why we should take such great responsibility in our life, some motivations that will help us see why being responsible for our choices is always the right thing to do. And then what I want us to do is look at some warning signs. Because, man, I fall into the same temptation as Adam and Eve did all the time, to look at someone else and blame someone else for my problems and for my choices, and to take no responsibility at all. But I want to look at some warning signs that will help us when we find ourselves in certain situations, acting in certain ways, that it will snap us back to reality, help us to see, am I taking great responsibility right now? So first, why should we be so responsible? Why should we take such great responsibility in our life? And it's pretty obvious. It's not that complicated. God is always watching us. And God will hold us accountable for the things that we've done in the body, whether they're good or whether they're bad. Jesus told a parable about some stewards. And a master gave one of those stewards 1 talent. And that steward was so afraid of what the master was going to do that what did he do? He buried it in the ground and he hid in fear. And he didn't do a thing. He made a choice, but his choice was to do nothing. And when that master returned, that master looked at that one steward and said, "Depart from me." You could have done something with this. You could have increased this, but you chose to do nothing. You see, that steward was responsible when the master came back. And when our master comes back, we'll be held responsible as well. We will also be responsible for the deeds that we've done. We'll be responsible for the choices that we've made. We'll be responsible for the thoughts that we've had. Many will say on that last day, "Lord, Lord, have we not done many great things in your name?" And he will eventually say, "Depart from me, for I never knew you, you workers of lawlessness." There will be many people on that last day who have thought they made the right choices. But in fact, they were making poor choices, blaming others for their choices, and ignoring the fact that they were even responsible for those choices at all. And so we need to take great responsibility knowing that God is going to come back again someday and He is going to reward us or punish us for what we've done. And if that's not motivation enough why we should take great responsibility, I don't know what else is. But here's another one, just in case it helps. There are also opportunities today to be of service to other people. And other people will be affected by our great responsibility. Do you remember Jesus' parable about the Good Samaritan? As the Good Samaritan was walking down that road, what could he have done? He very well could have walked on the other side of the road and ignored that man who was beaten down and left for dead by those robbers. But what did he do? He took great responsibility. And he walked over there, he picked him up, he put him on his animal, he brought him back to the inn, he took care of his needs, he even came back the next day. Because he realized, if I don't take responsibility, if I don't make this choice to help, who else will? And when we are responsible in our lives, when we are acting with great responsibility, when we're making the right choices and always willing to accept the consequences of those choices, then we'll be of service to other people. Paul talks about the body in Corinthians, about how each and every one of us does our own part. You're all capable of building up this church. But if you choose not to build up this church, if you choose to be a member that does not function properly, what happens to the rest of the members of the body? Well, they got to pick up the slack. And so when you act irresponsibly, you're not positively affecting the lives of other people, especially here at this church. Especially in the world, when we take great responsibility with the gospel, we will not be ashamed to proclaim the whole truth, and will not be ashamed to teach others about God. And so we should be responsible because other people can be positively affected by our choices and our responsibility. But the last reason why we should be so responsible is because you just don't know how much time you're going to have. You don't know how much time you're going to have. Let's look at 2 Peter chapter 3. Second Peter chapter 3. In verse 10, Peter says, "But the day of the Lord will come as a thief in the night, in which the heavens will pass away with a great noise, and the elements melt with fervent heat. Both the earth and the works that are in it will be burned up." That's the point. The earth is passing away. It's going to be burned up. It's going away at some point. In verse 11, he says, "Therefore, since all these things will be dissolved, what manner of persons ought you to be in holy conduct and godliness?" Knowing that this life is going to be over, how should you act? What choices should you make? And how responsible should you be? And he says in verse 12, "Looking for and hastening the coming of the day of the Lord, because of which the heavens will be dissolved, being on fire, and the elements will melt with fervent heat. Nevertheless, we, according to his promise, look for a new heavens and a new earth in which righteousness dwells." Understanding that this life is short, we ought always to be ready and ought always to be watchful, because you don't know when that last day is going to be. And for some, maybe that's a scary thought, that because we don't know when the last day is going to be, that we need to always be ready. And you might not be ready. You might not be responsible in your life. And if you're a little bit afraid about the fact that the coming of the day of the Lord is going to happen at a time when you don't know, maybe you're not taking such great responsibility over your life. Maybe you're not taking responsibility for the choices that you make. You know, the prodigal son, he had the luxury of being able to come back. He lived irresponsibly. He wasted his father's inheritance. He was completely living without any regard to the choices that he was making. Living for the flesh, caring only about himself. But he had enough time to come to his senses as he was eating with the pigs. Are you going to have enough time to come to your senses to start living responsibly? Or are you going to be living irresponsibly when the Lord requires your soul from you? So these are reasons why we should always be responsible, why we should be thinking about responsibility every day. And so, as we close off this lesson, let's talk about some warning signs. If you believe that you should be responsible in your life for your choices, whether you're making those choices or whether those choices are coming upon you without your blame, whether you're going through struggles and trials, whether you're making choices yourself, if you believe that you should be taking such great responsibility in your own life, then let's look at some warning signs about when we might not take responsibility. Some red flags to go off in our mind, to say, maybe I'm not being as responsible as I should be. So the first one, you ever felt victimized? You ever felt like a victim? If you go on social media right now, I guarantee you 90 to 95% of everybody that posts something on social media is probably feeling victimized about something. They're probably feeling oppressed about something. They're probably feeling attacked about something. We love to feel victimized. We enjoy it. It feels good to us to feel victimized. Do you remember Elijah? Elijah, as he in 1 Kings, was so completely distraught. Jezebel wanted him dead. He looked around at the nation around him, and nobody was following after the Lord. And he was so depressed that he called upon God and he said, Lord, it is enough. Please kill me. And he goes and he hides in a cave. And God calls to him and says, what are you doing here? You don't even understand the extent of the people who are still following me. You don't know everything. You aren't trusting me to take care of things. Get back to work. And he sends him off to go find Elisha. You see what happens sometimes when we feel so victimized is that we stop working. We throw up our hands and say, I give up. But what great work would Elijah have missed out on had he given up and had he thrown in the towel? Had he actually just died there? He wouldn't have continued on to become the great prophet and to do some of the great things that he did after that. When you feel victimized, think about Jesus and his Sermon on the Mount when he talks about being slapped on the cheek. You ever been slapped on the cheek? You ever had a brother or sister say something to you that just felt like a gut punch? So if you felt that way, understand that you have a choice on how you respond. Understand that you are responsible for how you choose to respond. Jesus didn't say, punch him right back. Jesus didn't say, hold a grudge for the rest of your life against that person. Jesus didn't say, let that situation change your attitude so that you are a grumpy, terrible person. Jesus said, give him your other cheek. It's radical. The choices that we can make in the face of great attack and victimization, rather than feeling like we are being attacked. Ask yourself in those moments, what choice can I make now that will positively affect my life and their life? Because you always have a choice, and you will always be held responsible for your choice. Next, if you find yourself being led by strong emotion, when you find yourself being led by strong emotion, you need to stop. Take a second and ask yourself, am I taking responsibility for my life and for my choices and for my attitude? It seems so obvious, but when that guy cuts you off on the freeway, that's his fault. But it's your fault when you start to get involved in road rage. It's your fault when you start to blast out any number of obscenities at that person. You will be held responsible for that. You will not be held responsible for that person and what they've done to you on the freeway. And here at the congregation here, if somebody angers you, if somebody upsets you, you have a responsibility to go to that brother and to try to make things right. You do not have a responsibility to then turn around and gossip about that person. Or you do not have the responsibility to then, or the right to go and hold a grudge against that person. Just because they did something bad to you does not give you license to do whatever you want back to them. And we acknowledge that, but when in the moment, when you're so angry, we forget that we can be angry, but we need not to sin. Be angry and do not sin. It tells us that there is a choice we can make. We can choose, in spite of our strong emotion of anger, not to sin. How about when you feel so caught up in the emotion of love? Young people, you find yourself so caught up in the emotion of love, and you just love that person so much, and you're willing to do whatever it takes for them. Watch out. Ask yourself, am I being responsible in spite of this great feeling of emotional love? Because many poor choices have been made by being led by this infatuation, by love, by being enamored with someone. Just look at David in his life as he looked down at Bathsheba, and he did all sorts of terrible things that he took no responsibility for. So love can lead us to do a lot of bad things, but let's say you find yourself so in love with that boy or girl, maybe take responsibility and ask other people, is this a relationship that I should be in? Seek out wise counsel and say, is this person somebody that I should spend the rest of my life with? Because I've seen so many people get involved in relationships and get married to people that they had no business being married to because they wouldn't take responsibility during the time they were leading up to that relationship beginning. So take responsibility. What about fear? You're so afraid of what other people are going to think. You're so afraid of what other people are going to say that you do nothing. Like that one-talent man, you do nothing because you're so afraid of what people will do or say or think. We can't be led by fear. We can't be guided in our lives by fear. That one-talent man had a choice to make and he didn't make it. What about hospitality? I remember, and I'll just say, there were a few people as Logan and Catherine were staying with us and Nathan and Allison were staying with us, and they came to us and said, you don't know if those people are going to steal everything you have or be serial killers or rapists or whatever. Because people, when we're motivated by fear, it causes us to seize up and do nothing. And if we're so afraid of what might happen or could happen in this life, we will do nothing. And so ask yourself, in spite of being afraid of what other people might think, afraid of the fact that they might judge me and my home, or judge me and the quality of my cooking, and so that's why I don't want to invite people over and be hospitable to them. If you're so afraid, ask yourself, am I being responsible with the gift that God has given me? To whom much is given, much will be required. And you've been given a lot. So don't let fear stop you from doing the right thing. Finally, and then the lesson is yours, the last point. I know we're running long here. Finally, if you start to feel like you are right, if you start to feel like you're right, ask yourself, am I taking responsibility? Who here has been right? I'm glad nobody raised their hand. That's good. We all feel right from time to time. We all feel like it is my right. It is owed me. I am correct in this situation. And we have done and can do many terrible things in the name of being right. Paul would talk about eating meat in the book of Corinthians. And he would talk about how if eating meat is going to cause someone else to sin or stumble or fall away, I will never eat meat again. Was it right for him to eat meat? Absolutely it was. There was nothing wrong with eating meat that was sacrificed to idols, as he talks about there. This is right. I can do this. But if it causes someone else to stumble, I'm never doing it again. But some may stand up and say, well, it is my right to do that, and I'm going to do it no matter what happens. So ask yourself in the moment, when you feel like you're right, all right, good for you. Pat on the back. I'm glad you're right. But are you making choices in spite of being right that are responsible choices? Are you making choices while being correct about a situation that are going to benefit other people and help other people? Jesus would have been right to call 10,000 angels to take him down off that cross. It wasn't his fault that he was there. But he chose to be there. And he was responsible for the actions that led to our salvation. But he could have been right. And he could have held up his rights. But he didn't. So when you start to feel yourself feeling like you're right, stop and ask yourself, am I being responsible for the choices that I make while I believe that I'm right? All right, so the lesson's yours. If there is anyone here this morning who hasn't yet given your life to the Lord, understand this, that at this very moment you are choosing. You are choosing now whether or not you will obey the Lord or not. You're always choosing, and you're always responsible. You're not going to be able to blame anyone else on the last day for your lack of choice. It's not going to be because the preacher was really boring, or the membership was really hypocritical, or you didn't like the color of the carpet, that is going to be any reason why God is going to say, all right, you get a pass. Enter in. You're responsible for the choice that you make, and if you're subject to the gospel call, then please come forward as we stand and sing.